It's hard to tell which Resident Evil character is my favorite, but there's a lot of them that are just so cool. Some of the Resident Evil characters don't get the recognition that they deserve, so today I'm going to be breaking down my top 10 most underrated Resident Evil characters of all time. Now, before jumping into this video, don't forget that this is my personal top 10 list, so don't go in the comments and hate me and say that this isn't a factual top 10 list, because this is just my personal list. Also, don't forget to hit a like on this video and hit subscribe if you want me to do more top 10 videos like this one. And without further ado, why don't we get into this video with entry number 10, shall we?
The preparations are almost complete. Then we can leave.
Good.
Starting off in my number 10 spot is Exel from Resident Evil 5. Exel was a very interesting character to say the least, but she also played a huge helping hand in Wesker's plan to destroy the world. In my opinion, it was looking out to be that she was going to be playing a huge role in not only the rest of this game, but the rest of the Resident Evil games moving forward. And with all that being said and done, I would like to think that her character went down as being a pretty underrated character, and not only that, but I think her boss fight was a pretty underrated boss fight too, to say the least. If you at least know what you're doing, and especially if you use the homing launcher, that boss fight can go down to be one of the easiest boss fights in all of Resident Evil 5. It's really unfortunate because I'm not really a big fan of the villain characters ever, but I was really on board with the character Exel and what they were going to do with her moving forward. Unfortunately, we never got to know much about her backstory, and we never really got to see much of her going on from Resident Evil 5. Also, we never got to play as her, unless you're counting the Resident Evil 5 mercenaries. So therefore, I'm going to have to put Exel at number 10 and the most underrated Resident Evil characters of all time. With that being said, let's move on to number 9.
The man is a wanted insurgent.
Yes, he's a mercenary, but right now he's under the protection of the US government. He's no threat to the PSAA.
Unless someone pays me to be.
Man, I'm not sure how many of you guys will agree with me on this one, but I think the idea of including Jake and having Wesker's son incorporated in Resident Evil 6 was an absolutely amazing idea on the writer's part. This is another character similar to Exel that I was really excited to see where they were going to go with moving forward in the Resident Evil franchise, but unfortunately, we never got to see really much of anything of Jake Mueller after Resident Evil 6. That, in my opinion, I think is a huge wasted opportunity, because whether or not they wanted to make Jake a hero or a villain, I think he would have went on to be one of the most impactful Resident Evil characters moving forward, seeing as he has the DNA of Albert Wesker. You just never know though. It is possible that Jake could be included in a future Resident Evil game, but until then, I'm gonna have to leave him in number 9 in my most underrated characters of all time. And with that being said, let's move on to number 8.
Court order for transportation. Prisoner Billy Cohen.
Yep, at number 8, we got Billy Cohen from Resident Evil 0. So with Billy, we got to know a little bit of his story and his upbringing, but after spending the whole game not only getting used to Billy ourselves, but watching Rebecca get used to Billy as well, just for him to eventually leave without a trace and without ever being seen again after Resident Evil 0. And with Resident Evil 0 being the prequel to Resident Evil 1, that means that all of this happened before Resident Evil 1 and before most of everything that we've seen to this date in the Resident Evil franchise. So it does really make you wonder and question just where Billy Cohen could be in this day and age in the world of Resident Evil. For Billy just to be a prisoner on the loose, he's really remembered for helping Rebecca Chambers get through the entirety of Resident Evil 0, and therefore he has my respect. Billy will be number 8 for my most underrated characters of all time. So let's move on to number 7.
that might interest you.
You might not ever think about this, but would Leon ever get through Resident Evil 4 if it wasn't for the help of the merchant? That single-handedly has to give him number 7 for the most underrated characters of all time, just for how little appreciated he goes for helping Leon in the entirety of his mission in saving the president's daughter. I'm so glad we got to see a second version of the merchant in the Resident Evil 4 remake, because what would the remake be without the merchant? He's also got to be one of the most anonymous characters in all of Resident Evil history, just for having very little dialogue and for not really getting to know much of his story whatsoever. I really wish they would have showed and talked about the merchant more and showed a little bit more in depth and broke down his character more in the Resident Evil 4 remake, because I highly doubt we're going to get any other version of him outside Resident Evil 4. In fact, he's so anonymous of a character that we go the whole time not even really knowing his real name or getting to see his real face. It's also worth mentioning that you can see Luis using the red 9 that you get from the merchant, so I think it's safe to say that the merchant helps not only Leon, but Luis on his mission as well, and when you play separate ways, you can tell that the merchant helps Ada Wong as well, so therefore the merchant has to go down as one of the most underrated characters, and one of the most helping characters of all time.
Welcome to Africa. My name is Cheva Alma.
Coming in at number 6, we have one of my favorite underrated characters in the Resident Evil franchise, and that is Cheva Alma from Resident Evil 5. She is another character that only gets included in one Resident Evil game, and that's it. And we do get to know a little bit about her story at one point in the game, so that does kind of make her not so much of an underrated character in terms of getting to know a lot about her. But she is pretty underrated in the fact that you don't get to play as her outside of Resident Evil 5 or see of her for that matter. But man, was she there the whole time for Chris Redfield, and out of all of Chris Redfield's partners that he's had that he's let down or they've died or whatever, Cheva stayed alive the whole time, and her mission was to just save her town, but she went farther beyond her mission to help Chris Redfield and his mission to take down Albert Wesker.
What was that thing?
Damned if I know. But right now it's got a hard-on for the only 2 stars left in town. You and me.
At number 5, I have STARS member Brad Vickers. Brad Vickers plays a huge role in the beginning of Resident Evil that not many people actually realize. See, back in the original Resident Evil 1, they were communicating with Brad via radio to make sure that he was going to be able to show up on helicopter to get them out of there. And that's exactly what Brad Vickers does at the end of Resident Evil 1. Which, I think that makes it super sad to see him go the way he does in Resident Evil 3, and to just know that there was no way that you could help Brad, even though he was able to help you guys. It kind of leaves you feeling sad, because you just really want to be able to repay the favor for Brad Vickers, but you never get the chance to do so. Instead, all you can do is kill his zombie version to get his keycard to grant access to the STARS office. I would like to believe that his death in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis 1999 is probably the true canon version of how he dies, because of course when we see him in Resident Evil 3 Remake, he's already a zombie version of himself, so we have no clue whether or not Nemi was the one that took him out or not. Also, it's very unique how Brad is the zombie that you can take out in the underpassage of the RPD in Resident Evil 2 the original, because that was a really fun way to be able to get the actual costumes to play with the rest of your playthrough.
Barry!
What is it?
Look out! It's a monster!
Let me take care of it! What the hell is this thing?
I found Kenneth killed by this thing. Let's report this to Wesker.
At number 4, I have another STARS member, which is Barry Burton. From what we've seen of Barry so far, he's always proven to be one of the coolest characters in the entire franchise, at least in my opinion. Back in the day, I used to think Barry was actually one of the most underrated characters in the entire franchise, but then we ended up getting a game called Resident Evil Revelations 2. I still like to think that Barry's a pretty underrated character for the most part, but if you're a fan of Barry Burton, Resident Evil Revelations 2 was an absolutely amazing game. To see the return of Barry Burton, but not only that, the introduction to his daughter Moira Burton was really interesting in the storyline of Revelations 2. I'd still like to see Barry Burton get included again in a Resident Evil game before he gets too old to fight off zombies.
Jill, you're alive. I was worried, because I thought you were...
Start talking.
Calm down, I didn't want to do it. Believe me, I can explain.
Don't lie to me!
Here we go with easily the most popular character in this most underrated characters list, Jill Valentine. Jill Valentine does make an appearance in a lot of Resident Evil games, but the reason why I have her in this most underrated characters list is because she hasn't been featured in a Resident Evil game in quite some time now. Jill Valentine must have been a popular character for them to use back in the day, but then as time went on and as they introduced a few more characters into the franchise, she started to kind of fade out in the storyline of Resident Evil. When you're looking at the Resident Evil timeline itself, you realize that Jill Valentine hasn't been included since Resident Evil 5. That is quite a long time for us to not see or hear from a certain character, especially such a popular character like Jill Valentine. Last we saw of Jill Valentine, she was brainwashed by the hands of Albert Wesker and forced to be evil so she could fight against us, but we were able to save her from her evil state and revert her back to being good and on our side. But ever since that happened, we have not seen how Jill has handled the situation and how she's gone back to living her everyday life. Now, some of you may know that we got Resident Evil Death Island, the CGI film that featured Jill Valentine, and it showed that after RE5, she's been slowly aging due to the effects of being brainwashed by Albert Wesker.
Yeah, I'm almost there. You know me, I'll be fine. I'll be back as soon as I find Chris. Why does everyone think I'm gonna get in trouble?
Now, at number 2, I have Claire Redfield, which out of everyone on this list has appeared in the most Resident Evil games. But the reason why I believe that she is such an underrated character in the franchise is because she never gets her chance to shine, and she never gets her chance to be a main character in the Resident Evil games. And when she has, it hasn't been a mainline Resident Evil game. She of course was the main playable character in Resident Evil Code Veronica X, but that one unfortunately wasn't a mainline Resident Evil game, even though most fans believe that it should have been. And for the most part, I think Claire Redfield has gotten overlooked by her brother Chris Redfield, hinting as the reason why Chris Redfield appears in most of the Resident Evil games nowadays. If I was to make a top 10 list for the most overrated Resident Evil characters, her brother Chris would easily stand at number 1 on that list. The last time we got to see Claire Redfield in the Resident Evil timeline would have been Resident Evil Revelations 2, as well as Barry Burton, and it was really cool to kind of see them pair up and work together in one hell of a game. Claire and Barry are both characters that I think are very underrated in the Resident Evil universe, and this game was their game where they just got thrown in it together and they were both given a chance to shine.
This is Nighthawk. Come in, Alpha. Alpha, do you read?
Nighthawk, this is Hunk from Alpha Team.
Man, I thought you were all wiped out.
In my eyes, when I made my top 10 most underrated characters, this number 1 spot felt obvious to me. Not many people talk about this man, but Hunk is a very underrated character. Apart from characters like the Merchant and the Duke, Hunk is one of the characters that have stayed the most anonymous throughout all of the years of Resident Evil. He's one of those characters that we get to see a lot in little game modes like Resident Evil 4 Mercenaries and Resident Evil Reverse, and when we get to see his moveset and what he can do, he seems like such a badass character that makes you wonder, man, why isn't he incorporated in more of the storyline? Because the only time he's been incorporated in a storyline that actually mattered in Resident Evil was Resident Evil 2. It was leaked a couple years ago that Capcom was supposed to be working on a game that was titled Resident Evil Hunk, which was supposed to dive into a lot of the lore about Hunk and the backstory of him. And unfortunately, as time went on to tell, that game ended up getting completely scrapped and they forgot about the idea of even doing that. I think Hunk is one of the most underrated / badass characters in the Resident Evil franchise, that giving him the number 1 spot for the most underrated Resident Evil character of all time. That's going to be the video for today. I really hope you guys went on to enjoy, and I really hope that you guys at least somewhat agreed with my top 10 list. I would love to hear your guys' opinions down in the comments below, and I would love to hear any of the Resident Evil characters that you guys think I might have missed for this list. It was really hard for me to try and pinpoint my top 10 list of most underrated characters because Resident Evil has quite a few underrated characters in my opinion. With that being said, I'm going to be doing a lot more top 10 Resident Evil video ideas in the future, so maybe I'll come back and revisit this one. Thank you guys so much for sticking through and watching to the end of this video. Make sure you guys hit like and subscribe, and lastly, comment down below as I will be replying to every comment. Also, I have a TikTok account where I post Resident Evil Reverse clips, so go follow me over there if you're interested in watching any of that. And if you want to watch more YouTube videos like this one, I post new Resident Evil videos every single day, so stick around for a new video tomorrow. Peace.